The second step to reclaiming a screen revolves around removing all of the emulsion from the mesh. Now, this is the number one dirtiest job in the entire screen printing process, and thus you kind of want to do it in batches and as efficiently as possible so that it's kind of not the worst thing in the world for your employee. Now, to remove the emulsion from the screen, there's a couple different ways we can go about it. One of the most common ways to do it is to use a chemical called emulsion remover, also known as reclaimer. Now, this can be used straight out of the bucket or sometimes comes in concentrate that must be then mixed with distilled water. Now, when you're applying the emulsion remover, you want to be using a high quality chemical sprayer. If you just go to the dollar store and get a sprayer, it's not going to work that well. These chemicals, it's not water. It will break down the sprayer itself, and then you're going to have all types of problems. So what we're going to do is we're going to spray the emulsion remover onto both sides of the screen. And we're going to take a scrub brush and essentially work the chemical into the screen. A couple things about this. One, you do not want to start with a completely dry screen. Your screen needs to already be wet, and typically you're doing this right after removing the ink from the screen, so the screen is naturally wet. Two, once you spray this, you do not want to let the emulsion remover completely dry into the screen, as this can lock up the emulsion, and essentially we're going to total the mesh and the screen is going to have to be restretched from complete scratch. So never let that emulsion dry in the screen completely, but also realize that we're using chemicals and we must respect the chemical process and the chemistry itself. This chemical needs around a minute or so to properly break down the emulsion. Now, a lot of this is going to come down to how many coats of emulsion are on the screen, the mesh count, and how much emulsion remover I put on the screen. Because this is a really thick screen that had a lot of ink deposit, it might take more time to break it down. Now, another way to remove emulsion from a screen is to use something called a dip tank. And a dip tank costs around $300-400 and allows us to essentially submerge around half a dozen to a dozen screens, depending on their size, into a chemical bath that can then break down the emulsion from the screen, and thus I no longer have to spray it or scrub it by hand. I can essentially just pull it out of the tank and then hit it with the power washer. Now, depending on how much chemical you have in your dip tank will kind of vary how long it takes to reclaim the screen or be removing all of that emulsion. So the more potent your chemical mix is, the higher the ratio of chemical to water, the quicker that the screen can be essentially reclaimed. So I'm going to take a screen out of the dip tank, and you'll notice that the emulsion already looks much more faded, like it's already been removed. We're going to then just turn on our power washer. Now again, by using the dip tank, the chemical was able to break down the emulsion much quicker, and again, removed a lot of the manual labor from it. So I highly advise any screen printing shop to purchase a dip tank, as it will save you thousands of dollars of labor, and again, make the most difficult, dirtiest task of the whole screen printing operation become much simpler for your employees. Now again, the other way to reclaim the screen was we sprayed it with emulsion and scrubbed it. Again, you can see the emulsion is being broken down, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult compared to the dip tank solution. Turn on the power washer. So, as you can see, it was much easier to reclaim the degrease, the screen that sat in the dip tank chemical bath solution had much better, longer time to essentially have the chemical break it down and so forth. Although again, this method totally works if your shop does not have the funds or the amount of space required for a dip tank. Now, when it comes to dip tanks, realize that they will not work with wood screens, as they will warp the screen itself and you'll have all types of problems. So they can only be used with aluminum frames, and typically you don't want to be putting diamond chased Roland Newman frames. Any of those special types of frames just have a bunch of pockets where you don't want emulsion kind of getting in there that the dip tank allows it to seep into. Again, I was just reclaiming these screens very quickly. You must make sure that you remove all of the emulsion. You don't want to be rushing this process. And again, it's very important that your industrial sink have a backlight so you can properly be looking at the screen for any emulsion imperfections. Also remember that you probably saw when I was doing this second screen, I flipped the screen and I was able to get all of the edges much easier. Realize that the bulk of emulsion is actually sitting on the print side of the screen, and sometimes it's just much easier to push it out that way. So you're going to need to be able to, again, using the power washer on both sides. Don't get too close, because you always do then run the risk of potentially ruining your mesh. If you have any questions about reclaiming screens, please do not hesitate contacting us. Thank you.